would like, you can start.
All right, wonderful. So I would like to welcome everybody to our this next event in our series. As I was just saying, I think this is the 12th or 13th event that we've had in the lecture series, and all of them have been remarkably well attended. And of course, as soon as I start speaking, my phone starts ringing. But we actually have done 3 events this month. And so I just wanted to share with everybody that we're going to take February off. And as I say that, I also just want to thank the team that is putting this together all the time. So it's not just Henry and Veronica, who we see here, but Laura Mahadna, who has joined us today, and Carol Mason and Trevor Butler have all contributed to this. And I do want to point out, none of them have to do this as part of their regular job, but we think this series is just a wonderful opportunity for people to share around the world. And we also, it's amazing to see how well our YouTube channel of all of these videos is doing now, where every lecture that we've done now has more YouTube views than the number of people who participated live. So please check that out as well if you get the chance. So today's is a very important workshop, though. It's about decolonizing design, and over the last little while, we've been working with the advocates for equity in design education, who are going to be working today with Wanda Dalla Costa about creating this workshop. And I do want to do a kind of a, I do want to recognize the AEDE, because if you can imagine, this is a student-led group at the University of Calgary School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape. So in addition to going to school full-time, and many of them are working as well, they've taken it upon themselves to address this critical issue. And it's almost like, it's a really poignant reminder to us that all of us who are faculty and all of us who are working in the schools, that we really need to address this issue, and we really need to address it now. So the AEDE has been very kind to actually talk with us and work with our students as well, as we, for example, plan our new Masters of Architecture. And I think it is important that it's student-led. And it's also important that they're doing all of these events as well, that they're doing programming around monthly themes and a lecture and discussion series. They have a reading club and a podcast as well. And so they're also, and I think this is really important, they're creating an open source resource bank, and you can find, they fortunately have a very, very simple URL, which is aede.ca. Now, today, Joy Olagoke, Melissa Amadio, and Sasha Simic are going to be moderating some of the questions, but I also just wanted to recognize the contributions over time that Vivian Ton and Vincent Yong have made as well. They've been all a part of our sessions, and it's really invaluable to have their participation, and I hope that they will continue, and I hope that we will encourage and support them. And with that, I'd actually like to hand it over to Joy, who's going to introduce Wanda. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Douglas. So Wanda is a member of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation. She is an architect, a professor, and a YBCA 100 2019 honoree. This is an award which celebrates people, organizations, and movements shifting culture through ideas, their art, and their activism. Wanda is also the first First Nations woman to become an architect in Canada. And at Arizona State University, ASU, she is the director and founder of the Indigenous Design Collaborative, a community-driven design and construction program which brings together tribal community members, industry, and a multidisciplinary team of ASU students and faculty to co-design and co-develop solutions for tribal communities. Wanda holds a Master of Design Research in City Design from SCIARC in Los Angeles, as well as a Master of Architecture degree from the University of Calgary. And so just before we hand it over to Wanda, I just want to remind people to turn off their videos and their mics during this proportion of the workshop, just to maintain bandwidth and an easy flow. And when we start doing some of the Q&As, you can come back on and contribute. But thanks a lot, and we'll hand it over to Wanda now.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the introduction. Welcome everyone. Wanda Dalla Costa and Ntsigat Sana Miswichi Waskaganik Wuchinia. That is, I am Wanda Dalla Costa from Beaver Mountain House, which is what we call Edmonton. Today I wanted to talk about decolonizing design. This is becoming, I think, an increasingly important topic in architecture schools and in design schools around the world. And I think, where I'm situated right now, and I'll share with you why and where I am in the US right now, there's a tremendous increase in diverse people, not only within the country, but also entering architecture schools. And to me, I asked myself, what are we going to do about it? So today, what I brought for you are 5 topics. And I'll go through them just quickly, just so you get an idea of the overall intent for today. I wanted to talk about the research mechanisms that I operate within, which is the ASU body, but also my private practice and my lived experience. Then I want to bring in 2 important concepts that I think, and I hope, because I know there's a large international group joining us today, that I hope will connect with many of you. They're broad concepts, and I think they're really important for us to begin to open up our lens to additional ways of thinking in this. The number 4 that I brought is a process, is a methodology, and I'm hoping by sharing and being very transparent with the way we work, our placekeeping framework, that this will give you tools to take home with you to your home country. And then finally, the 5th section, what I wanted to do is share, I guess this is more aspirational. As I work through Indigenous design, we're interested in 4 different components for the future and really delving into them. And so I want to share with you what I think will be really important for this topic going forward. So before we begin, we often do these territorial acknowledgements, and I heard someone speak about acknowledgement, saying that, it's great to acknowledge the people of a place, but what are we going to do about it? And so I'm always interested in more interactive or engaging ways to engage this notion of territorial recognition. So what I wanted you all to do, and I have a series of these, we sometimes do polls, we sometimes do chats. Today it will be a series of chat room discussions. What I would love for you today is to go to the website. You see it on the line, and I believe someone will add that website in the chat room. Enter your city. And in the chat room, write the cultural groups of the territory that you're in. So I will share with you, let me see if I can do this live. I'm going to share my screen. So if you can see nativelands.ca, and I'll just refresh it so you see what happens. They have a bit of a disclaimer. It's they call this a work in process. So it is a living laboratory of territorial recognition. You will then go to enter your hometown. It zooms into the hometown, and then it begins to give me the groups of my hometown: the Woodland Cree, the Métis, and Tsuut'ina is actually a band, so I think I must be on their territory. So as you can see, it's a very interactive map. So take a minute and let's do an actual territorial recognition. I'll give you a minute to work through. And many of you come from international groups, and you may not see your countries represented on there. I encourage you to pick a city. What this will help, I think, going forward in the future, it allows us, wherever you are, once we start to populate this map globally, it allows everyone to understand who the original inhabitants were and their land base. And I think this is a really important concept for the subject we're discussing today. So I'm anxious to see the results. There should be a lot of beautiful names of very diverse groups listed in the chat room. So as you're working through that, let me just start into the research mechanisms section of my PowerPoint. All right, so what I wanted to share with you today is the three entities that I operate within. It's important to recognize our lived experience as Indigenous people, and I think as diverse people from around the world. And what that is just a representation of the experiences and choices of a given person and the knowledge that they gain from these experiences. As you can see in the pictures, this is my grandmother's house. We grew up out in Satellite Cree Nation, no running water. We didn't really notice, to be quite honest. It was a pretty remarkable place to grow up. These are my cousins. This is us. These two pictures are really the best playground I could have thought to be blessed with growing up. A barn, we always had animals around. There were always hay bales to climb on, and then a wonderful forest that we could explore as children out in the wilderness. The second research mechanism I wanted to share with you is the IDC Indigenous Design Collaborative. People always ask me, oh, you're from Edmonton, Alberta, how did you end up in the US? And I said, if you look at the map, the territorial map, all of the colored portions, there are the reservations in the US. So Arizona is a very, very dense place with Indigenous peoples. It reminds me a lot of times at home, it has the same richness as where I'm at in Alberta. What that brings to us in terms of our work, we have 22 tribes here. There are 55,000 Indigenous youth in the pipeline. And we have 3,000 Indigenous students at ASU, which of those, 52 are Indigenous design students. For many people who teach in architecture schools, this is a really remarkable statistic because we are so keen on getting more Indigenous practitioners to the field. So we have a really beautiful base here in Arizona. We have two faculty, myself, and I brought on one of the other award-winning architects from who teaches at ASU to help me mentor the students. And we typically have 4 students and working during the year, but also during the summer. And we have one intern that helps us engage the research and helps manage the research. The other research mechanism that I operate within is my personal firm. It's called TWOW Architecture Collective. We often refer to it as TOW, but it's really a space of, as you see on screen, possibility, plurality, relationality, collaboration, agency, and resilience. We have a series of areas of focus that I think are different from most firms. They center around Indigenous ways of being, knowing and doing, participatory design, mentorship, a multi-generational approach, and earth-centered design. So let's talk about the first broad concept that I really get excited about these days, because it seems to be able to offer an ability to kind of open up our minds and think about what if. And it's called Indigenous Futurity. And before I get into the details of Indigenous Futurity, I also want to share with you a definition of Indigenous. People often ask what we consider to be Indigenous, and I think it's really important to outline that. But I think what we want you to remember from this concept of Indigenous Futurity is that creativity to us is a portal to be able to change policy. So if I can create ideas that would inspire policymakers, planners, managers, administrators, I've done a service to our community. So this is really what it's about, is just enabling change in outcomes. So let's look first, before we get into IF, let's look at a definition of Indigenous. And this definition comes to us through the United Nations. And if you read through it, when I look at this, it is a very broad definition. And I believe that we should be able to include many cultures which are not typically associated as Native Americans of America. So for instance, the Australians, but I think also when I look at some of the numbers on there, and I outlined number 7 in red, a resolve to maintain and reproduce ancestral environments and systems as distinctive people and communities. So when I look at our quickly developing global areas, I think of Dubai, I think of Shanghai, I think of these really quickly developing centers that I would assume, I would guess that many of those people from that area would like to maintain and reproduce their ancestral environments. And so I think this notion of indigeneity is really quite broad and includes more folks than what we think of as Indigenous. All right, let's get into Indigenous Futurity. I've called this What is IF and Who is Doing It? So let's talk about what it is. The definition, well, the term was coined by Dr. Grace Dillon. She's a professor of Indigenous Nation Studies at Portland State University. And the term is used to represent past future visions where we construct self-determined representations and alternative narratives about our identities and our futures. On the right, you see an image that is still taken from a wonderful video. I encourage you to go on YouTube and search for that video, Imagine if Toronto Were Reclaimed by Nature. It's a video of Indigenous Futurity. It's a short video, but it'll give you an idea of what it looks like in video form. There are also a number of great resources coming out, and I listed one there, the CBC podcast, Indigenous Futurisms, which is also a really phenomenal resource. And I just want to remind people why this is so important. And the reason is because it challenges assumptions that consign Native American peoples and lifeways to the past, right? We're still here. And it uses creative thinking as a pathway toward Indigenous revival. So the base belief is that our thoughts and our actions toward our future are very important, and it makes some futures more likely and others less likely. So these worlds, and they're happening in gaming, it's happening in architecture, it's happening in video, it's happening in writing, have been called ethnoscapes. And many of you might recognize from the movie Black Panther, the city of Wakanda. That is similarly called Afrofuturism. So, you know, the similarities between the two movements, I think, are really important for all diverse peoples going forward. So let me give you an insight into an artwork that is from the notion, or that is an Indigenous Futurism project. So let me just read to you the description of the image you see on the screen. Storytellers remembering futures from the past takes place in a new world 7 generations from now. The earth has become uninhabitable and humankind has been forced to find a new home amongst the stars. The Dene moved to a planet with 2 moons who hold the world in balance. This world is the 5th world that the Dene have lived in, the next step in the creation story. The people terraformed the planet to look like their home in Round Rock, Arizona. The hogans, which are the traditional Dene houses, are partially made of glass and rigid woven panels. The image depicts storytellers who are remembering creation stories and archiving them to be shared later with their community. They use a form of telepathy, with each dot representing a story from Dene history. The piece is aiming to show the resiliency of their culture, of the people and the stories, and how it is all maintained and nourished by the matriarchs of their family. No matter what they live through, they will not lose who they are as Dene. This is another futurism image, and this one talks about the 2 halves, and I'll read you a short passage. This is about the alternative views around gender. We are stars and nebulae between Grandfather Moon and Grandfather Sun, our spirits stretching from our traditional territories to these cities. They stretch and reach and braid the space-time continuum. They vogue, sashay, jingle, and grass dance to transcend colonial violence. We are the spectrum that binds 2 halves, and we are essential. Our presence empowers complete ceremonial circles, not of one or the other, but both and all. We are the center in between. Our rightful place is the center. So you can see how as words are so powerful to be able to imagine a new future, how can architecture help in imagining that new future? So who is doing Indigenous Futurity? So this is an organization. I encourage you to spend some time digging around their site. It's called the Initiative for Indigenous Futures, and it's a partnership of universities and community organizations dedicated to developing multiple visions of Indigenous peoples tomorrow in order to better understand where we need to go through today. They have 4 main components. They offer workshops, residencies, symposia, and an archive. And a really fun part of their site is every Friday, they welcome everyone, the members of their team, to log in, and they will show you around the site and help you customize your avatar, and even teach you how to build a snowman in their virtual classroom. So please spend some time going through that website. It's really, really fantastic. The other group that I noticed is doing a lot of work in this realm is called Cultural Organizing. So it's a commissioning series led by IIF, where artists are invited to illustrate their work for future generations. So let's talk about, as we talk about Indigenous value systems, which is at the heart of, I think, the change in going from architecture to Indigenous architecture. It's very value-based. And so this is really the imperative that we're trying to get to, is how we bring an alternate or other set of values into the built environment. So I give you an example on screen. For Cree, which is part of my community, the natural world, the hunter becomes part of that ecosystem. And in their act of hunting, there's a series of values that are remembered and articulated through the act of hunting. And they include respect, sharing, reciprocity, generosity, and so forth. And those value systems are enabling the relationship, a guide for the relationship between all animals and people, as well as people to people. So what I want to do next, now that you know what comes at the basis of our worldview as Indigenous people, it's very much value driven. And so what I wanted to do is introduce a chat exercise for another 3-minute exercise related to values in the built environment. So please participate with us. What you will find in the chat room, you will find a link to that beautiful poster that you see on the right. So this is done by the Harvard Design School, who recently introduced value systems as a way to reimagine architecture and planning. It's called the Just City Index, and it was developed by an organization within called the Just City Lab. It features 12 principles, which you see in big text on the bottom, and then 50 values that can be used to reflect. This is what they were hoping, that will be used to reflect on the unjust nature of our cities. So again, they're trying to make cities more just. So what I would ask you to do, let's see, I'll move one slide forward to give you an instruction here, is that take about 3 minutes and select one of the Futurity images that you see on screen. And let me just move this out of the way. So you can see number 1 is the Hogan that we just discussed. Number 2 is the image with the object up top. And number 3 is the woman in the beautiful regalia. Pick one of the Futurity images that appeals to you and ask yourself, which of the 3 Harvard Just City values do you feel that the artist was aiming to express or communicate in their art piece? And share in the chat room. So for instance, I picked number 3, let's say, and to me it indicates trust, hope, togetherness. And the idea here is that what I teach my students at ASU is that we really have to begin to think about other ways of looking at the world. And I think value systems are a really powerful way. So take a minute to go through.
As you guys start to write out your answers in the chat box, I'll start to read some common answers out to everyone. Take your time though. So the first image, we're seeing to get a lot of answers around durability, connectivity, hope, belonging, engagement, and rights. For the second image, we seem to be getting a lot about inclusion, mobility, reconciliation, spirituality. For the third, a lot around hope, aspiration, identity, power, engagement, beauty.
Excellent. Thank you, Melissa. It's so interesting. We do this exercise often in our classrooms to be able to shift the thinking. So thank you very much for participating in that. And I hope that you see the connection. I'll draw it through another case study that we'll be looking at going forward. So what I wanted to do is close the futurity section by talking about what it looks like in practice. So we were invited to, we need to link, I think, theory and practice, because I think it helps us understand how this can come into play in our careers as practitioners. And so we were given, there were 3 Indigenous architects. We applied to do somewhat of a competition for a parliament building across from Canada's Parliament. It was the former site of the American Embassy. It's 100 Wellington Street is what it's often referred to as, but they wanted to convert it into Indigenous people space, which is where the Métis, First Nation, Algonquin, and the Inuit peoples would gather to, in terms of their head offices. So after we cried many tears on our drawing board for being given a colonial building to redesign, we decided that we needed to take a bit of an extreme approach. We wanted to make a bold statement. As you can see, we wrapped the building in a glass covering. Fortunately, it was failing thermally, and so this was our excuse that we could wrap it in an encasement, just like a time capsule, and then add articulation of our culture to the exterior. As you can see, the site is here. And this is directly across from the Canadian Parliament building. We were not given this parcel, but we thought it was very important. The sacred fire to us represents truth, and we thought it was very important for that to play a role in that direct relationship with the Crown. As you can see, our team was nearly all Indigenous, and we made sure, because we had to represent both First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, that our team had representatives from each of those significant groups. In terms of our inspiration, we thought it's really important, first of all, because it's when we're working in urban environments, it's important to recognize the diversity, but also pay tribute to the ancestral territorial holders of that area. So of course, in this area, it's Anishinaabe, Algonquin peoples, and their traditional architectural form is the wigwam. We also wanted to develop a layering within our buildings to be able to also recognize different traditions of their material culture in that region, such as birch bark basketry, the Métis sash, which we often attribute The Métis people are often the forgotten ones in Canada. They are the mixed, and they're often left out of significant projects. So we thought it's very important to be inclusive. And then we wanted to differentiate the diversity within Canada. We have 617 First Nations, but also a number of different Métis and Indigenous communities. And that exterior wrap, we thought, is a way to articulate all of the diversity in Canada. So you see on the screen our big moves. We articulated not only the nation-to-nation access, the land, the wigwam inner structure, the wigwam outer structure, a blanket wrapping around, which to us is a gift, protecting and comforting, but then also representing all the diversity of Canada with these beautiful leaves, snowshoes, feathers. Some people see different things in the exterior of the building. So there you go. These are some images from the exterior. And one of the most special, talking about values in architecture, one of the most special occurrences that happened during the design process, our elder, Winnie, she is Inuit. To us, elders are like a moral compass. They keep reminding us of the big, what is really, really important. And she said to us, yes, this project is in Ottawa, and yes, a lot of people will be roaming in suits around this area. She said, but what about the people that aren't in suits? How can we be inclusive with all the people that are in Ottawa, including the people not in suits? So we ended up putting a soup kitchen inside the building for all people to feel welcome. So that's a value system. The organic forms that you see, this is a lower level view on the left and a higher level view of a series of oculi at the top of the building, which is really about connecting to Father Sky in the design, but also articulating the nature-inspired form of our building. In terms of the exterior, you see the feathers or the regalia that we attached to the building. The idea, it's very inspirational, was to really bring all of the voices of all of our communities together, and each one would have a feather or a snowshoe to personalize. And finally, there are a series of gathering spaces in the building. You'll see the one on the left is up top and on the right is on the lower level. As you know, we gather as Indigenous people, and it's very important for us to have those spaces. And so we wanted to make sure that they were plentiful in the building. So if I was to think about that building in terms of its futurity, and if I had to relate to those value systems from the Harvard Just City values, I would probably lean toward thinking of this as an act of authenticity coming from a team of Indigenous designers, character, which is really that notion of kind of surprising people with a very bold architecture, spirituality, connecting to many things that that are related to our spirituality as Indigenous people, adaptability, agency, representation, and ownership. So let's talk about the second big concept today, and that's the notion of plurality. And I think this is really important because I hear it emerging in many circles in and around the topic of Indigenous design. And it's really the notion that people are starting to realize that the practitioners who create architecture are very different from the public who is using the architecture. And I think there's many interesting things happening in the field to be able to broaden that. I've also brought two case studies to share with you to show you examples of our practice of how we begin to talk about plurality, but also what is happening in policy right now in New Zealand. So many of you may have seen this Bolivian architect called Freddie Mamani. There's a waiting list for his work. The color, the form, the playfulness, almost postmodern, but extremely unique, seems to be a unique new style. Does it look like what we teach in architecture schools? Probably not so much. It's very different, and I think we need to get to the heart of why it looks different and why people are connecting to his work. The case study I wanted to share with you is really, I think, for us, something that we worked on last year in Hawaii with Kamehameha schools. We were asked to conduct a placekeeping study with the school's leadership team. They're essentially an educational entity that manages the education of Indigenous people on the island, but at the same time, they had been given a large trust fund, so they've become somewhat of a land developer in Hawaii. So they're in a fortunate position to have the finances to actually make true change. We identified a series of challenges. We read an article, you see the article on the left. We identified a series of challenges and confirmed them when we met with the group. And they had many challenges identified, and they're not unlike what we experience on the mainland. Displacement, loss of place, environmental degradation, and so forth. But I think that the one that hit home very hard was the last one, the misrepresentation. So they were very critical of many of you who've been to Hawaii of the conceived or manufactured, fabricated external identity that was placed upon them. They commented that even the the big the luau, where you have the big celebration, had many elements that were not true to actual culture, and so they were really pushing this notion of getting to more authenticity in the design of Hawaii. So we did a number of tours. We went to these two offices that you see on screen, and we observed many things, but what we really stood out for us with this notion of rebirth and how important it was to the local community people that this was a pathway to well-being. So for us, I think it's also one of the important things that came out of this was that they were creating new aesthetics in the field. And we believe it is based on a series of value systems. So if you look at this office where creatives gather in Hawaii on the island, that is turf. You take your shoes off at the front door and you connect with Mother Earth in this office space. Really unique concepts. But and this office on the left is a graphic designer who is using more symbols and myths and story and narrative from the past to begin to reinvent merchandise, hats, t-shirts, and so forth. So there's a really powerful rebirth. What we know from Indigenous planning studying on the mainland is that it is an integration of many things. It's people, it's place, it's their knowledges, it's their value systems, it's how they make decisions, and it all is leading toward transformative work or transformation. And so we took them through a series of exercises, and we're very transparent about our process because we think it helps to enlarge these ideas. And I share with you here that these activities only took 30 minutes. It does not take that long. So we asked about what are the barriers to futurity in Hawaii? Very simple. Put it on a sticky note, share out, let's talk about it. The second activity we did, let's talk about value systems. We went to a local museum, found these beautiful Pacific Islander values, and we said, yes, this is more broad around, the more regional in terms of the people. But if you were to hone in and create value systems, which of these are challenged by development? So we wanted to get them thinking about their value systems. And then finally, the third activity we did, again, very short, 30 minutes. We read an article and we assumed a series of assets, asset identification. So as you can see in light blue, green color there, are a series of assets we collected. And we said, this is your starting point. Besides what we've identified, what we found in this beautiful article, what else? What else? Where else do your assets lie? Because we want to re-emerge those assets into the process of architecture. And finally, the last activity that we did with them was to really ask the community if you could generate a building that was all about placekeeping and futurity. What happens in that space? What does it feel like? Who participates in that space? So I will say that in a short day spent in Hawaii and another day touring and another day doing some activities, we had a phenomenal starting place for getting work done with that community, and the work is ongoing. I wanted to bring you a second case study. So this one comes from New Zealand, far, far from across the ocean to New Zealand, where a lot of really interesting futurity and placekeeping is taking place. And many of you may be familiar with that, but the basis of it is that the Maori felt like their voices weren't articulated in urban design. So they got together, they asked, started discussing with the city, there was a convening, and it turned out that they created a national Maori cultural landscape strategy that, when they created it, ended up in policy. So again, the idea of creativity impacting policy. So here you see the key objectives of the principles. Look at how beautiful it is. They're enhancing all appreciation of the natural landscape for everyone, not just them, not just the Maori people, but it's also protecting and reinstating Maori knowledge and understanding. And finally, it's guiding culturally appropriate design processes. So very beautiful ideals behind this system. And I wanted to bring you, as we're talking about values today, I wanted to bring you some of their core values that they articulated. The natural world, holistic hospitality, unity, cohesion, collaboration. I think all of us can appreciate during this time of COVID how beautiful having a set of values to guide a city are. So I bring you just an example to share with you what it looks like in practice. This is the Glens Innes Music Center. So for example, the stilts are recognizing the trees. The names have been given by the local people that talk about the sound of the wind. So concepts that we would not be able to articulate from a non-Indigenous point of view. There are art installations all around the outside of the building. The programming allows space for culture to flourish. There are artist integration everywhere in the building, including carvings, soundscapes, and wayfinding. So as you can see, there's a richness to these buildings based on principles, based on value systems. So let's take another short 2-minute exercise or less. Reflect on your home city. And what I would like you to do is imagine you're responsible for leading a large urban development. Who would you put in a room to contribute to your city's futurity? And again, just write your ideas in the chat. And I think one thing that I often share with my students is that when we think about cities, you know, I call my students, you are the citizen experts. You live there, you have the, you should have the agency to be contributing to ideas as one thing, but then I also remind them that cities are filled with physical infrastructure, the buildings, roads, environmental infrastructure, water and energy, social infrastructure, recreation, entertainment, cultural infrastructure, which would be galleries or festivals, as well as the economic and political infrastructures. So there's a number of different things coming together. I'm reading the chat room. And I just want to lift up what I'm seeing in there. Someone mentioned children, elders, many cultures, many underrepresented people. And I was recently reminded by one of my students that if your advisors in terms of city development do not include youth, that you are missing a really important narrative in future city making. So thank you for lifting that up. It would be lovely to send this chat to our city planners and our policymakers. So for the sake of time, maybe we'll just move on. I'll let you continue to populate that notion, and we'll move on. I wanted to move on to Indigenous placekeeping. So this is where I wanted to share the method that we use to be able to do our work at the IDC and in my firm's practice. I'll talk about the framework, and then I'll give you 2 example projects that I hope will clarify how we do this work. So people often ask me, What is the difference between placemaking and placekeeping? So as you can see, the definition for placemaking is on the screen. Active care, talking about place and its social fabric by the people who live and work there. I think Indigenous placekeeping also proposes that it's led by citizen experts who have the lived experience of that place. It's aligned with local value system and assets. It includes Indigenous ways of knowing being, values, and our processes. And it utilizes more holistic measures of wellness, which could be social, cultural, spiritual, physical, or economic. The first part of the four-part process is community-led. So the pictures on screen are some images of our typical engagement and sessions. But I think for us, what's really important is that vital to the success of each project is the pathway that leads to a really, really collaborative design process. So community members become our partners in the process from day one. We, as architects, simply offer technical assistance in order to build their vision. So they define the challenge or the problem, and they advise on the pathway to get there. Process-based. So Indigenous architecture is very heavily process-based. It involves engaging Indigenous people as co-collaborators in the production of context-specific architecture. We don't believe there's a one-size-fits-all, so we have developed over the years a suite of engagement tools designed to uplift local narratives. You see in the image on screen, this is a mobile design lab where we move the whole studio out to the res. A critical part of this work is really being transparent. So we want our clients and our community members to understand the process, what's happening in the process along the way. In terms of place-based, this is so important because something that we refer to these days, we call it hyper-localized design. We believe that community members bring generations of understanding, including local history, landscapes, landforms, the understanding around landscapes and landforms, the worldview, the stories of place, microclimate patterns, and most importantly, the spatial cultural meaning that has been interrupted and that we are trying to provide a chance of rebirth for. So, and a lot of times we share with our clients that we think design work is actually research. So when we research with the community, we are really listening, and we have a funny saying at our in our firm, that we listen for 90%. It's a 90-10 rule, that we listen for 90% and only talk for 10%. So the last quadrant of our placekeeping framework is reciprocity driven. Every project we rethink in terms of what it gives back to the community. So for instance, many communities have construction companies or tradespeople. How do we design the building so that the local people are ensured participation in the construction? Youth is another aspect of reciprocity in a field which remains vastly underrepresented in terms of diversity. We often bring our young Indigenous interns to connect with local youth to inspire careers in architecture. So, I mean, just being able to bring culture and make room for programming is another method of reciprocity in the work that we do. So let's reflect a bit more. We're going to do another little chat room exercise. I want you to reflect on your home city and what you consider the Indigenous people within. What do you think, and this is often one of the hardest places in the Indigenous placekeeping framework that people are wrapping their head around right now, but I want you to think about your city and imagine reciprocity. What does it look like to your local Indigenous groups or your local cultural groups? So write your ideas in the chat. What do you think reciprocity means to your city and the people in that city? And I'm specifically talking about the underrepresented voices in the city. And I'm just reading all of the beautiful answers right now to all of the other chat sessions. Really, really lovely. So while you're populating answers, I will share with you what placekeeping looks like to us. So I brought two examples. The first I bought was a class. We were asked by someone, the answers are so lovely. I'm going to hold off so I can focus on getting through the rest of this PowerPoint so we can get into a Q&A after this. And so we did an interdisciplinary class, as this is a very dense and rich area in terms of diversity, we were asked by someone to create a class about how the campus better reflects Native cultures. So we brought a series of Indigenous students together. I thought it was important at this, we work with non-Indigenous and Indigenous students, but I thought it was really important for them to lead this work. So there was a group of about 6 students. And I share with you the book that we produced and a few pages from the book. So this is our timeline. Of course, we were leading with the placekeeping framework. We did a series of research studies. These are 4 of the 22 tribes in Arizona. First Nations, we call them in Canada. So we studied not only their architecture, but their lifeways, their material culture. We studied globally different processes that are being articulated from Australia to New Zealand to North America to be able to share out with people. And only after we did all that did we actually get to the design work. So the students had 16 proposals, and we are fortunate enough that we were able to have 2 of these built. So the president of the university, Michael Crow, it's the largest public university in the world, took the book, and again, how creativity influences policy. He looked at that book, saw all these creative ideas, and he could see and imagine what it would look like in form. He asked us to build 2 of them. So right now, this just went up. It's a language greeting wall. We worked with local Indigenous graffiti artists to create this cool calligraphy. We embedded the wood letters into resin, and it's welcome in all of Arizona's 16 languages. And then right now, we're designing, it's just in the last throes of production with a local Indigenous artist. We're designing a table for the library in a very Indigenous-centric portion of the school. So let me show you what it looks like in terms of placekeeping looks like in terms of a project. So this is a student-led project. And essentially, we took the definition of Indigenous architecture, which is offered by a person called Hirini Matunga, New Zealand. And it's a beautiful definition of architecture that serves as our guide right now. It's an experiment. It's a very interesting way to think about whether your architecture is Indigenous by using this as a metric, because it's quite a challenging metric. So I'll go through it quite quickly, and I will send this PowerPoint to everyone so that you can dig deeper into this subject. Indigenous architecture should have a clarity about its genealogy. Indigenous architecture should link to an Indigenous archetype or archetypes. You'll see here that we went way back to Casa Grande and looked at solstice and equinox patterns. Number 3, it should be a response to Indigenous peoples' defined needs. So these were the needs identified by the community. It was really about energy efficiency and nation-centric design, but we had a number of other benefits that we would bring as part of this home. Number 4, it's an articulation of cultural and social values. Again, back to the values. We ended up building this structure to be able to understand their building form. And number 5, it's a response to a place-based narrative. As you can see, this is the res that sits right beside Phoenix. It's a very different landscape, not only in terms of density, but also in terms of vegetation. Number 6, it's a structural form informed by Indigenous worldviews and cosmology. You see here the student trying to connect to all of the solstice and equinox. And finally, number 7, it has an ascribed Indigenous meaning. So again, we were using the original shade structure to be able to understand some of the impact that we could make with that architecture. So the last section I want to share with you is really my aspiration and hopes for the future. I called it Design as Ceremony. But what I really want to share with you are areas where I think that I think are ripe for research in this field. So these are the 4 or so last slides before we close. So first of all, I think we need to begin to study cause and effect in design. What you see on the screen are 2 buildings that are located quite close to each other. One is designed by a non-Indigenous architect, one by an Indigenous architect. The building that you see on the top has been criticized heavily. The architect was trying to articulate a fortress, and he was trying to say that education should be a fortress. The community finds it very cold, very sterile. The materials don't connect. Some of the colors were not in line with the local community belief systems. So it becomes problematic. And I think, you know, when I think of terms like speculative design, which is something that's coming up to the forefront in Indigenous architecture, but I think in many other discussions of theory, we need to ask what the effects our designs have on future societies. Number 2, I think we need to integrate not just, you know, architecture is often about the bright, shiny object at the end, but I think we really need to understand design and architecture from an Indigenous research paradigm, and that includes all of the above: ontology, epistemology, axiology, and methodology. So ways of being, knowing, doing, and value systems. Number 3, I think we need really to think hard about whether we can be empathetic. An author, the quote that you see on the screen is from a gal who writes a lot about collaborative process in urban design and architecture, Barbara Brown Wilson. And she says, because of the structural racism and classism, it's really hard for people outside of the immediate group to understand the unique knowledge that exists within our communities. And then finally, the last area of research, I think for me, is really about the integration of 4 knowledges. In Indigenous architecture, you know, we often, this is what we teach typically through is number 1, contemporary knowledge. But I think we should remember that a lot of Indigenous belief systems should connect to empirical knowledge, which is what we learn over time from the land. Traditional knowledge handed down based on stories. So how do our buildings include places for storytelling, include places for observation? And revealed, how do our buildings include spaces for vision, ritual, and ceremony? So hi, thank you for listening, and I welcome questions. And I've asked a couple of the organizers to help field the questions. So feel free to put your questions in the chat room and we can have a discussion.
We have one question that's come up so far. Maybe as we're waiting for a couple more, we can revisit one of your most recent poll chat questions and just look at some of the responses and share them. I know everyone has access to it. But it was kind of nice to think about how and who people thought should be included in some of these processes in their cities. So some of the ones that really stuck out, there's several, but in addition to including voices that are maybe underrepresented, somebody was talking about providing spaces for people to really represent and live out their cultural values. A woman named Cassie mentioned that one. And I think that's important too, for providing opportunities for people to feel validated and valued, that they don't have to necessarily conform to just whatever is around them, but they can still feel free and accepted as they express themselves in their cities. Somebody else was talking about providing people with the same opportunities. And I think that starts to question who we really privilege in this city and how we can make spaces perhaps more equal or accessible for those who feel like they don't have a spot at the table. Another one was talking about some social support and infrastructure. So providing more opportunities for connection in the city and showing how people can lead and help contribute despite maybe not being in those explicitly political or leadership roles. There's still an opportunity for community or citizen leadership in creating these spaces. So those are a few of them, but I think.
There's some great questions coming in.
Yeah, so this first one we can start with is, how can we educate clients so that they should care and build Indigenous architecture?
And that's an interesting question. And I think part of our work at the IDC is sort of lifting up this topic so that people understand that it's unique, and that there are really beautiful outcomes, right? Because we're getting a completely different lens and inspiration to create the architecture. And as you saw from the one picture, the project I showed from our firm, the architecture can result in a new typology and a new way of thinking. So I think for me, it's really right now at this time, it's about pushing that out into the world, sharing not only how the products are different, and then showing them the process that we got there. And hopefully we inspire them through those two aspects. Great question. Thank you.
I have a little bit of a follow-up thought or question based on your answer there. And I think, yeah, it's really important to educate our clients. But something you mentioned in your presentation is that, and sometimes we can lose a level of authenticity. So when dealing with clients that might not be as passionate as we are about these subjects, how do we develop a design process and carry this through the whole design process to the built form that doesn't lose authenticity on the way? Are there any recommendations you have?
Yeah, and I think, it's related to the second question that I see emerging in the chat room about, this notion of respectfully connecting to cultural architecture. And one strategy that we have found really important, you notice that in a lot of our work, we work with Indigenous artists. We know that there are not enough Indigenous architects that represent every one of our tribes in Canada and in the US. And how do we bring authentic voices? And so we've discovered that the best way is to actually co-pilot a project with a local artist from that community. They will be your best mediators, moderators, facilitators, information gatherers, people connectors. And so our new policy now is not to go in community unless we actually have someone from that community with us. And I think this is really, really important. And I also that our communities are often exhausted from having research done them, and they can be tired of responding to questions. And I often tell people, who's not tired? Artists, because they do this for a living all day long. They are thinking about these things, and they're just waiting for that opportunity to share what they have been thinking about. So I also advise people, not only artists, but the other segment of the group who are not tired are our youth. They are our next generation. And so I often say, if you are finding a community that is reticent or holding back, tap into their artists and their youth and see if you can just bring that energy forward. Yeah, great question.
I think that's also important that you recognize or mention there's not equal representation across all the tribes as well. And even when you were working on your Indigenous Peoples Place, you worked to try and have as many people represented because not one culture believes the exact same thing. So also trying to see how we can get in touch with more, to not put assumptions that every First Nations person or group of people has the same values. So another question is, how can we convince designers to create such spaces that include Indigenous heritage? I wonder if you think that maybe this is an issue of policy, where it's something that won't be done or can't be pushed forward unless it's mandated, or if there's a softer way to make this something more prevalent in design?
This is a timely question because we were just asked through this sort of more public work that we're doing at the IDC. We were asked by a local city, the city of Tempe here in Arizona, to help them indigenize their city. So this is actually happening. And so we were invited to city council. We were introduced to, they have a Native American council member. And right now we applied for a series of grants, got one grant, and we're now working the IDC with the city of Tempe to begin to think through that wonderful program that was introduced in New Zealand, Te Aranga, by the Maori people, to bring that process back to Arizona. And I suspect that once we do it once and bring that to North America once, and of course we'll advertise it like crazy because that's what we're about, is about sharing really good best practices. I suspect that once they see one city doing it, every city is going to jump on board. They're not going to want to be left behind, right? We're in a different time. We're in a different era. So I think it's really, really critically important to be able to, whatever work you do in this field, lift it up and push it out into the world so that people see what you're doing and can emulate and copy that work. Yeah. I see, I'm looking at the chat room on the side, and there was a really interesting question that I feel like we should talk about. I don't want to lose this question, and it was from Jocelyn Makedo, and it was a question that I think is one of the, it's an important part of this work. They ask, how can we respectfully reproduce ancestral environments? There seems to be a resistance by certain bands to allow non-Indigenous people to become familiar with their ways of knowing, and they consider it appropriation or misrepresentation, when she was referring to the community schools. And I think this is really important because people often ask, can I do Indigenous architecture? Am I able to do Indigenous architecture as a non-Indigenous person? And we say yes, by all means. And I think, part of what our aim is at the IDC is to lift up the practices that show how to do the work in a good way. And I think also including bringing in local knowledge brokers or cultural advisors, elders, youth, artists, bringing that local, the voices and narratives into the project, I think are, critical practices as well. But I think it's really important to remember that these communities live within a really tumultuous past with institutions in America and in Canada, right? Everything from, the treaties to segregation in reserves and reservations, to the policies of boarding schools and residential schools where we were, they tried to whitewash or, take the Indian out of the Indian child. There's actual policies with those words. And so I think there's a general distrust of people from the outside. And anyone who is going to do work with Indigenous communities, you have to have a tremendous amount of patience and humility and understanding to be able to, and I use the word empathize, but it's a challenged word to me. It's really hard to empathize the distrust that these communities live within. And so my advice would be really to be open and to be honest with them and acknowledge your lack of understanding. Acknowledge that you're here as a champion, as an advocate. Just really be upfront and share your process broadly. Be honest about where you feel you're lacking techniques or methods. And I think to me that they will open up to you once they see the humility and the sort of realization that you are struggling within this work. So I think it's a really, really important question. So thank you for that, Jocelyn.
Someone else asked something that kind of continues on that in terms of, they were asking what are key considerations to help architects and designers interpret Indigenous heritage carefully in terms of space and placemaking. And in something you commented just now in talking about being patient, in considering how there has been some distrust in the past, and that maybe takes a bit of time for one to get that trust again for people outside the community. But I think that's also important to recognize when one is engaging in those types of projects, that perhaps in order to be patient, maybe you can't necessarily stick to the conventional timelines of trying to do a project, because people may feel rushed or like this isn't a genuine partnership. This person was specifically talking about their experiences in South Africa with Indigenous architecture, but perhaps you can comment on that further.
Yeah. And if I understand the question, it's about process, authentic process, and where you get your inspiration. And so we have, and I didn't share it, it's a diagram that we do before we start designing. So most people are excited there to get their pen on paper, you know, before they even get into a community. And we have a 4-part process that first we research, the first quadrant is researching architectural history, lifeways, anything that we can find from authentic sources to be able to have a sort of underlying basis. But then we ask the community, in that first quadrant, we ask the community, what is the best way to engage? Who should be sitting at this table? What is the most appropriate process? What level of engagement are you interested in? You know, just kind of getting a field scan. We call it the initial inquiry. Then we enlarge. The second part is that we enlarge our team. We ask for master builders, elders, youth, all of the co-collaborators to help us to understand what are the, there will be things that are off limit and things that are articulated or that can be articulated in the design. So yesterday I did an engagement with a local First Nation in Canada, and we have a series of exercises. And one of the exercises was name cultural associations that you think would be appropriate for your new cultural center. So we asked them, I'm not going to, you know, assume that it's going to be the eagle or a circle or a east entrance. I'm going to actually verify and ask. And through that engagement, which is the third quadrant, we do small, large one-on-ones, and we deep dive into certain areas and certain concepts. So for instance, we were designing a school with a medicine wheel interior, and I had a Blackfoot elder as my co-designer, and he put a series of markings on the floor. I didn't know what, I'm not Blackfoot, I didn't know what any of it meant. And I said, can you explain this to me? And he said, no. He's like, when the building's built, you come back and I will take you through the teaching of that medicine wheel. And I said, this is perfect, right? Some things we're not supposed to understand when we're designing. I'm just asking my collaborators to help me navigate the physical construction of these spaces or design of these spaces, and the learning might come after. So, and then the final part of that quadrant of our placekeeping framework before we start designing is to really confirm. After our engagement, we come up with a series of design drivers that we think are relevant to that project, but then we confirm, did we get it right? Are we on the right track? We might be completely wrong. Throw darts at this is the words I usually use. Like, nothing is sacred about my work, and we can throw it all away and start over again. And so this confirmation of the drivers, all of that is done before we actually put our pen to paper. And so I think that care and time that goes into that preparation before we design is really important. And does it take a long time? A couple of days. It's really, you get 2 or 3 team members spending a couple of days doing research, planning some engagement exercises, analyzing the contents, and just confirming. And I think through that process, you'll get a lot closer to tuning into authentic meaning in Indigenous design. Great question.
I think that's just a really interesting point you touched on. The level of engagement, not just at the beginning of the design process, whenever you're talking about whether it's Indigenous populations or just other marginalized groups in society, you follow through with that relationship, even to when the built form is done. Ask them what do you think is doing well, what can do better, maybe even 2 years after the architecture is built. I think that relationship following through is really, really key.
There's a couple more questions in the chat. One person is curious about how we can address the need for 21st century living, essentially how you can address this rapidly urbanizing society, or a place for Indigenous people, migrants people people from rural backgrounds and other locals, designing a place that accommodates the needs of the 21st century while still acknowledging Indigenous roots, both local and regional?
That's an interesting question. And I think I would, hypothetically return a question. Are Indigenous value systems and the roots of Indigenous living, which is about communal, it's about collectivity, it's about, earth-centered design, perhaps that reflects more people than we think it reflects. And if we were to hone on those Indigenous roots, it would actually closely resemble inclusion for many different cultures. When I think of the New Zealand example about unity, cohesion, spiritual connection, belonging, a sense of belonging, these are all qualities in our cities that I think we all would aspire to. And so that's what I would ask. I would ask, is it perhaps it's one and the same?
Well, Sasha, your mic is, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I just got a question here from Jay Boyce. I'm curious if you think it would help in the decolonization of the profession to include Indigenous culture studies courses as a part of mandatory Con Ed requirements for architects. So how do you think, Wanda, that might be integrated into curriculums, or how might courses like this kind of end up looking?
I mean, from being an architect and having to do a lot of Con Ed courses, you skim over them, and it's kind of a very superficial education you're getting with Con Ed. So I think I would ask you, can we actually include it earlier? Is design school the right place to have that education? Yes, for sure. But should it even be earlier? Should people be studying, and I've got an 8-year-old here at home, and they're starting to learn lightly about culture, but I think it starts there. It starts with our 8-year-olds. And I think that sort of opening begins there. But I think in architecture school, there should be an entire section year beyond a course that specializes in the hyper-local design of that region. So I think one of the best programs in Canada, Laurentian University, many of you are probably familiar with the school, where they do a very hyper-localized deep dive into that region of Sudbury, Ontario. And they create ice fishing huts, they create canoes, and they learn, similar to our act of building that shade structure with the Gila River Indian community here, they learn local craft production techniques. And at the same time, while they're learning how to build ice huts and canoes, they're learning about local culture and lifeways. And I think that applied learning is much more powerful. As you know, when I talked about the 4 modes of learning, that empirical land-based kind of integrated way of learning is much more powerful than anything that we could find in a book. And so I would encourage architecture schools to rethink their programs, but also K-12 to really set the stage. And then, of course, yes, have a Con Ed course, but it would be something that they would be, developing lifelong, these understandings.
To continue on that, even though it's a very good point to say that we should be introducing this way earlier than just relying on continuing education requirements, still, how can we potentially address those current professionals? If perhaps a Con Ed stream isn't the best option, what choice or what opportunities can we maybe start to integrate that they take this into their current practice, because they hold a lot of leverage designing the spaces that we inhabit today?
So, and we are currently developing a series of modules that we will be, because we're getting asked a lot from big firms in the US and in Canada to come in, give a lecture and to teach about what it looks like and how we engage in Indigenous design. And I realize we're in a period of reconciliation and this is kind of a hot topic, and people are now reaching for straws. Where do I find this knowledge? And there's really very little out there. A few of us, there's, I don't know, about maybe 10 of us that are involved in academia right now. So we're starting to write about it. We're starting to theorize about it. But there's very little information out there. And so we're developing at IDC a series of modules that we would be able to somehow give to different firms as a base starting point. And then we would come in after they watch the video modules and we would work with them on a project that they're working on, almost like a fee-for-service type role. And we would help them understand how to bring local narrative into their project. So I think it's going to be a combination of some public offering in combination with, I guess, more personal one-on-one or IDC team on an architecture firm, Indigenous-led sessions. And I think that would really, really help push, especially some of these big, large firms. It would help push them in a really good direction.
That seems great, especially in terms of not just offering these modules and then walking away, they do the modules and hopefully that's that, but then trying to work with them after they have come to this base understanding and seeing how you can work together to help influence their practice. I think that's super solid. Similar to what Melissa was saying in terms of the engagement, I guess you touched on it first, and coming back to interact with people and see how the building is working for them or what suggestions or changes they might implement, keeping it a dialogue and not just a checkbox of do the module and suddenly you are good to go, all. So.
And we should also remember, this is a living subject, right? 10 years ago, there wasn't such a thing as Indigenous architecture. Right, so we have to remember this. We're in early in the process. So, yeah.
I think someone raised an important statement or question here, is that there are so many people outside of the loop. So thinking of just not designers. So is there a need to educate the majority of people on what if so they can also require it from their designers and architects?
No, I think that's a great idea. I think the more aware we are as a collective, not just the architects and designers and the planners and so forth, but I think the more aware we are, I think this will become second nature practice to a lot of us and a lot of the work. And I think once you've seen it done, which is what happens at the IDC, once they have engaged with the community directly, you can't go back. You cannot put your pen to paper until you actually feel like you know who you're designing for, and so I think of all of those people that have, all the expats that have, moved to cities like Dubai and Shanghai. And I think at some point they'll also have an awakening that, we might be missing out on really valuable information of this very rich place with a very, very deep history. So I think there'll be a point, it'll come where we will not be able to turn away from this hyper localized design. I really do.
That seems like all of the questions for now. So.
Yeah, excellent. Great questions. Thank you so much for all of these really, really deep questions. I appreciate it. I
Yeah, thanks for the dialogue and sharing your responses. We'll have to perhaps share this chat when we also can share your presentation with the participants. Is there one more?
Well, Joy, thanks a lot. We will definitely be sharing the chat with you, Wanda, so that you have a copy of that. And if anyone is interested to read the chats again, I would be happy to share as well. And again, today's session will be recorded or is recorded, and we will be posting it on our YouTube channel. So stay tuned.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Could I just say as we start to wrap up, I do want to mention I have never seen the chat box in one of our sessions so active and engaged. And so I think it's a tribute to you, Wanda, and to the AEDE that you have kept us all engaged for the last hour and a half. And it was a wonderful session. And I just want to thank you and Joy and Melissa and Sasha for moderating all of the questions. And hopefully this is just the beginning of a dialogue, because there's clearly something really going on in the chat box today. And we have to figure out a way to keep it going. So thank you to everybody for participating today. And we'll look forward to seeing you again. As I mentioned, though, we're going to take a break for February, and we'll be back in March. And certainly today, we got some very interesting ideas of where we might go next. So thank you. Henry, is there anything else, or are we?
No, with that, I think we're okay. So again, I'll be sending notifications on how to receive your certificates in a little while. And otherwise, we'll be posting today's session on YouTube. So please stay tuned, and we'll be keeping in touch with everyone. So with that, I'd like to close the session. Thank you, Wanda, and everyone who was part of today's session. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.